The back door of Record Plant Studios on West 44th Street opened at 12 past midnight. December in New York had a particular kind of cold. Not the kind that stings your face, but the kind that settles into your chest and stays there. John Lennon stepped inside wearing a heavy wool coat, his round glasses fogged from the temperature change. And for a moment he just stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. He had been in New York for about a year now. He liked it. He liked that nobody here treated him like a relic. He liked that the city was angry, that the streets still smelled like protest signs and tear gas, that people here understood what it meant to mean something with music. After everything, after the Beatles, after Yoko, after the deportation hearings Nixon's people were quietly running against him, New York felt like the only honest place left. The man at the Rhodes piano didn't look up when Lennon walked in. Marvin Gaye sat in the low yellow light of the control room's overflow space. No beret that night, no velvet jacket, just a plain black shirt and the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting in the same spot for a long time, thinking about something he can't quite name. His fingers rested on the keys but weren't playing. He was looking at a point somewhere past the wall. There were no managers in the room, no Motown reps, no Atlantic handlers, no press people, no one from either camp whose job it was to make sure nothing interesting happened. Just two musicians, one piano, and the silence that only exists inside a recording studio after midnight. Lennon pulled off his coat and sat down across from him. "You look like a man waiting for something that already happened," he said. Marvin looked at him then. He smiled slightly, the way someone smiles when they recognize a joke they've heard before. "Maybe I am," he said. This meeting had been arranged by a mutual friend. The details of who exactly and how exactly have always been vague. The kind of vagueness that comes either from people protecting something or from time simply doing what time does. What's clear is that both men knew who the other was, and that they had, separately, been circling the same territory for months. Madar, 1971. What's Going On comes out and changes something. It's a protest record that doesn't sound like a protest record. It sounds like a man standing in his own living room, grieving. Marvin had fought Motown for that album. Berry Gordy called it uncommercial, said Black America didn't want to hear about Vietnam, and police brutality set to jazz arrangements. Marvin looked at him and said, "Then I'm done." The album came out. 2 million copies in the first year, and it was doing what Marvin had always known it would do, making people feel something before they understood it. That order mattered. September 1971. Imagine comes out and Lennon becomes the face of a movement he already was. No possessions, no religion, no countries. The melody was simple enough to be sung at a candlelit vigil. The FBI hated it. Nixon's people were building a case to have him deported, not because of drugs, the drug charge was the excuse, but because a man who could make a generation believe in peace was dangerous to the people who needed that generation to keep sending its sons to Southeast Asia. Both men, in other words, had been told to stop. Lennon picked up a guitar that was leaning against the wall and tuned it loosely. He played a chord, then another. His style had always been angular. He attacked notes rather than invited them. It was honest, it was raw, and it carried the specific velocity of someone who had always believed that if you said something loud enough and clear enough, people would eventually have to listen. Marvin listened to the chords without comment. Then he began to play along on the Rhodes, and something immediately became apparent. These two languages did not naturally fit together. Lennon's guitar was a fist. Marvin's piano was an open hand. Lennon was writing in capital letters. Marvin was writing in the margins. "You know what your problem is," Lennon said after a few minutes. He wasn't being cruel. He was being exactly as blunt as he always was, the way a person is blunt when they're still figuring out what they actually think. "Your music is too beautiful. People hear it and they feel sad in a comfortable way. They cry a little and then they go to sleep. Nothing changes." Marvin took his hands off the keys. He looked at Lennon the way a man looks at someone who has just said something almost right. "And your music," he said quietly, "makes people angry in a comfortable way. They shout for a week and then they go to sleep. Nothing changes either." Lennon stopped playing. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere on West 44th Street, A cab horn cut through the cold air. Inside, the reel-to-reel in the corner kept turning because nobody had thought to turn it off. "Then what do we do?" Lennon said. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a man who has been running at a wall for years and is starting to wonder if he's been running at the wrong wall. Marvin thought about his brother Frankie, who came home from Vietnam with something missing behind his eyes. He thought about the version of What's Going On that Motown had tried to bury, where a man doesn't scream his rage but carries it in the curve of a note, in the space between words where the listener has to meet him halfway. The most political thing he had ever done wasn't a lyric. It was a choice of key, going falsetto when every instinct said to shout. "You make them feel it before you make them understand it," Marvin said. "If you explain something, people can disagree with your explanation. But if you make them feel the weight of a mother waiting for her son who isn't coming back, they can't disagree with that. That feeling is already inside them. You're not putting it there. You're just finding the frequency." Lennon was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not the dismissive kind, but the kind that comes out when something lands. "The frequency," he repeated. "You sound like a preacher." "I was raised by one," Marvin said. "Didn't take, but some of it stuck." They played through the night, not with a plan, not with a producer directing traffic or a session running sheet taped to the console. Just two men finding their way towards something neither of them had a name for yet. Lennon's guitar began to soften, not weaken, but soften, the way metal cools and becomes more precise. Marvin's piano began to carry more weight. The notes spaced further apart, each one allowed to breathe before the next one arrived. At some point near 3 in the morning, something shifted. Lennon played a chord progression he had been sitting on for weeks. Something he couldn't quite finish, couldn't find the center of. He played it once, then again. Marvin listened with his eyes closed, and then without a word, without any signal, he began to sing. Not words yet, just a melodic line, a falsetto that climbed in exactly the place where Lennon's chord had left a door open. The two things fit together like they had been written for each other. Lennon stopped playing to listen. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. Marvin's voice was doing the thing he had never been able to do with a guitar. It was making the argument without stating it. It was carrying all the anger and all the grief and all the particular American weight of 1971, and it was doing it without raising its voice. It was doing it by making you lean in. The engineer in the booth had his hand on the fader, not sure whether to raise the levels or to stay absolutely still and not risk breaking whatever was happening in that room. For about 40 minutes, they built something, a song without a title, without a finished lyric, without an arranged structure. It existed the way only things built between two people at 3 in the morning can exist, perfectly temporarily, in the specific shape of that moment and no other. Lennon's stripped-down anti-war cry wrapped inside Marvin's aching soul frequencies. Two protests becoming one feeling, the kind of feeling that doesn't ask you what side you're on before it breaks your heart. Both of them knew somewhere underneath the music what they were really doing. They were trying to find a language that a white kid in Ohio and a black kid in Detroit could both hear and understand as the same thing, not the same words, the same wound. Then Lennon looked at the clock. He said he had to be somewhere. He stood up, put on his coat, said something low to Marvin that the engineer couldn't make out. Marvin nodded once. Lennon walked out the back door into the December cold and was gone. The reel-to-reel had been running the whole time. By morning, the tape was gone. The engineer would spend years trying to explain this in ways that held together. Equipment failure was the official line for a while. Misfiling, a tape taken by mistake during the shift change. None of it fully held. What he came back to, when he talked about it at all, was simpler and harder to dismiss. The session had been logged. The tape had a label. And then it was not there. The world in December 1971 was not short on reasons why two men, one black and politically radical, the other a British national already facing deportation proceedings, recording something together at midnight might attract the kind of attention that preferred its subjects to remain separate. The FBI had open files on both of them. COINTELPRO had spent a decade making sure the threads of American descent never wove together. A recording that united the language of the Black Civil Rights Movement with the white anti-war movement, making both audiences feel the same grief in the same moment, was exactly what certain people in certain buildings could not afford to exist. Two men who both wanted peace, who both used music as a weapon, but who had entirely different ideas about where to aim it. One believed you had to be loud enough that the world couldn't look away. The other believed you had to be quiet enough that the world had no choice but to lean in and listen. The system that watched them both understood something they were still discovering, that together they were more dangerous than either of them alone. Whether someone took that tape deliberately or whether it simply vanished in the chaos of 1971 has never been settled. What the engineer said in a conversation decades later: "I don't know what happened to the tape, but I know what I heard. A man teaching another man something about silence, about how the space between the notes is where the truth lives." He paused. Lennon walked out looking like someone handed the answer to a question he'd asked his whole life, and Marvin just sat back down at the piano, like there was still more work to do. There are nights in 1971 that history recorded carefully and completely, and then there are nights like this one. A room, two voices, 40 minutes, and a tape that the morning swallowed whole. Both men kept making music after that night. Both kept fighting the same fight in their own languages. Lennon with his fist raised, Marvin with his hand open. Neither of them ever mentioned that session publicly. Maybe there was nothing to mention. Maybe the missing tape was the whole point. Some things are most powerful when the world never gets to hear them. What's certain is that for one night in December, two people who were supposed to stay in their separate lanes sat down in the same room and found the same frequency. And the same system that had spent years trying to silence them both decided in the end that this particular sound was the one it could not let exist.